Hey guys, and welcome back to another edition of the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. I am Ray Russell, and this is Ask Bob Anything, Part 2 here in early 2025. Kicking things off the right way, answering many of the listeners' questions. We're going to do that again this week. We continue on, and in order to get those answers, let's welcome back to the show the man himself. Here he is, Bob Roop.
Hey, Ray, and for our listeners out there, hello. I hope you're finding peace and tranquility now the holidays are over. I'm glad everybody hopefully made it through the holidays without too much trauma, and now we're off and running on another year.
Well, Bob, last week we got a lot of positive feedback. Imagine that, doing a little Ask Bob Anything segment, and so we're going to continue this week. We had so many questions left over, plus a few late to the party. They sent in some questions, so we'll try to fit them in by the end of the episode as well. But last we left off, you'd answered a ton of questions, but we have a ton more in front of us. I kind of teased a few, give everybody an idea last week at the end of the show as to some of the questions to come. And this week we're going to kick off with some names you may have encountered throughout the course of your wrestling career. But before we get to any of the names that I mentioned at the end of last week's episode, you started to tell me a brief story offline, and so me being the co-host here, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to ask Bob anything before I get into any of these questions here this week. I was hoping you could share your story with all the listeners out there about your encounter in the ring with one David Sammartino, the son of Bruno Sammartino.
I was booked with David. I was running through my memory, trying to remember exactly where it was. It was up on the East Coast somewhere. I didn't work up there much. I worked a few times when Vince McMahon Sr. was the promoter. Eddie Graham took me up to Madison Square Garden 2 or 3 times. But I was working in, I want to say Concord, up where in the East Coast somewhere. Anyway, it was with David Sammartino. And, of course, Bruno, he wasn't a champion at the time for New York, but he had a long run there, and his name was known, throughout the wrestling business. There wasn't anybody. It's interesting because Bruno wasn't like the WW or like the NWA champion, where he went from territory to territory. He just worked in the WWF.
Yeah. But by the time David had broke in, Bruno had already retired from semi-retired from the ring. Right. Yeah.
Right. I never met Bruno, but I was working with David, and he was, a nice-looking young man. He was very well built. My understanding was he had he had done some bodybuilding. He was a
power lifter.
He was a power lifter. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good. He looked good, and so he was short. And you have a guy with this name, but he's about 5'8" or 9, and he looked good. But again, he wasn't. There's no, unless you're like 300 pounds, say you're 5'3", but you're 350 pounds, like a Jerry Blackwell, for example, you can get away with it. If you have of course, Blackwell had that great agility and ability to move all that mass at very surprising speeds. But David, I remember I figured a way to try to get him over was his strength, because he did look like a strong guy. I did a thing where it's just a series of stuff where everything that you do leads up to me getting slammed. He slammed me the first time, and I'd sell it and act like it hurt my back a little bit, and then I'd foul him, or I'd do something where I was going to try to slam him and have him, come down behind me, or do something where he counters it and slams me again. And I remember that we were working in a steel ring. It was, whatever the building was, arena, field house, whatever it was, had their own ring. And it was a boxing ring.
Mm-hmm.
Boxing rings are steel rings that have no give. The footing is meant to be stable. The ring is not supposed to bounce up and down, because boxers are constantly, moving up and down on their feet. And if they need to be able to time their hand and eye and foot, they need to be able to coordinate all those in order to launch an attack or to defend themselves. So the boxing rings are real stable, and they're steel. So when you get slammed off that, it's just I mean, I guess there's not much difference between steel and concrete, but they're both, you know, they're both they're very unforgiving on the back. So I had him slam me in the ring a couple of times, and I had about 3 more slams lined up, spots in my own mind that he was going to end up after, always the same way, that he ended up slamming me to try to get him over as being strong. So I figured I'd do the, like, slam 3, 4, and 5. There was a mat around the ring, out on the floor, around the ring, and I figured I'd do a deal where we were out on the floor. I'd have him chase me around a little bit around the ring, and then I'd stop him and go to slam him and have him counter it and slam me on that mat. But there was one side that didn't have a mat, and for some reason, I don't know, I lost, I wasn't paying attention. So for the series where it was going to be 3 or 4 slams in a row, I ended up in that spot where there was no mat. So I got slammed on the concrete floor 3 or 4 times. But, again, the slams, I learned how to do landing from being a paratrooper. There's a thing called a parachute landing fall. And you land in such a way that you don't have any hard surfaces like your elbows, your shoulders, or your hip bones. Everything that hits the ground or whatever surface you're landing on, you can land. If you're coming at full speed, you hit the water full speed. It's just like landing on a hard surface because you're going so fast. That force doesn't have time to get dissipated, and it's just as traumatic as if you were landing on solid ground. I had learned how to, when I got slammed, I never landed flat on my back. When I took a backdrop, I never landed flat on my back because it was jarring. It always jarred you to land flat on your back. It did me anyway. So I always landed on my side, on my right side, and it landed on the hip, not the hip bone, but like the buttock, quad, the upper leg, and my lat. They're all massed muscle there, or blubber or something there that could cushion a fall a little bit or a slam. And that way, I would never have a guy slam me 6 times on the flat of my back. I mean, you're asking. Imagine if you did that every night for a couple of years, you'd have to retire. Yeah, and with David, I remember the match got over. He was very nice. I talked to him afterwards, and he was congenial. He didn't have any errors or any ignorance in terms of his attitude because he was had a famous name, but he was just like one of the boys. I felt for him in a way, and I mentioned it before we got on the air about the similarity to being with Mike Graham, and I guess you could add to it with maybe at a lesser, but with the Von Erich boys. When your dad is a very famous person, sometimes it's hard on the next, on the kids, on their children. You try to live up to, well, I mean, we don't have to talk about action history. We can look at the McMahon family right at the moment, and I'm not trying to bring anybody down, but, people create their own stories with what they do. I'm sure that sometimes, you're not real pleased with what your parents or your grandparents do to leave you, whatever kind of legacy they leave attached to your name because your name is the same as theirs. Bruno, of course, was somebody that, he wasn't infamous of being like a real jerk and somebody who just, was, like Jack the Ripper, somebody like that. His dad was admired and respected. Well, he drew a lot of money, millions of dollars up there for the promotion. I hope he got his share of it. We've talked about
Bruno had, he had things in place to make sure he was getting paid. So, or he simply wouldn't have been working throughout most of his tenure there. So Bruno was very wise. He was one of the early guys that made sure he got percentage of the gates, and they took care of business with Bruno. In fact, they had to, beg him to come back and hold the belt the second time in the 70s because he'd wanted out. He'd wanted out as far as being the champion after that long first run that he had there as the champion, losing it in the early 70s, and then coming back. They needed Bruno again later on for a few years there in the later 70s to carry the belt once again. But you talk about Bruno, the star, the wrestling star, the big name draw. it wasn't just that. He wasn't just a hero to the fans. He was just a stand-up guy in general. You don't hear a lot of people say negative things about Bruno Sammartino. And, you know, I always go back to the story. I think Bruno's the one that told it, but he would say that even when he went out to dinner, yeah, he enjoyed some nice wine with his dinner, but if he was out in public, he would never drink, even have a glass of wine, because he knew there could be fans, kids around, and he wanted to, you know, maintain that, not just a babyface persona, but just he wanted the kids to be able to look up to him as, you know, what a role model or whatnot. So that was just kind of Bruno's take on life and just everything. But for David to try to even attempt to fill Bruno's shoes, he had a, you know, big trouble ahead if that was, you know, the case. But fortunately, I think with David, as I watched some of his early 80s stuff in Georgia, he wasn't too bad in the ring, honestly. No. You know, that was a year or so into his career, so it wasn't like he should have been, you know, superstar by that point. But David was holding his own okay for where he was on the card at that point. Unfortunately, I don't know what, you know, everything that went awry in between, but he never really got over anywhere near to what I think Vince wanted him to when they brought David in. And again, that was, you know, in order for them to get Bruno back into the company, they had to use David. And unfortunately, it never really worked out there in the mid-'80s with David Sammartino. And he would kind of flounder, and we'd see him pop up here and there, work for Herb Abrams, UWF. He even randomly appeared on a match or two in the mid-'90s working for WCW, did David. So you never knew where he may pop up. He probably hadn't been wrestling for a few years, but he was in great shape by then. I think he had some medical help by that point in time in his life.
Yeah.
He had an interesting career. It wasn't, you know, very long, and it wasn't, you know, documented very well, especially outside of his WWF era run. But he, you know, he was certainly one of those second generation guys that, you know, like you said, it was hard to follow in those footsteps.
Well, there was a couple of things that brought up responses from me. One was about Bruno wanting to get out from under the weight of being Bruno and here you are, you've got all the money you need, and where are you? You're back where you've been 100 times in the past, in the same dressing room, the same town, away from home, away from having any kind of personal life, away from your family. If your wedding anniversary, you're not home. You know, if it's your kid's birthday, you're not home. And you got all the money you need, and yet here you are. And Hulk Hogan was one that told, he made it clear that he worked and he was making millions of dollars a year, but he was afraid to miss even one show because he got a bad knee, and he kept working even with a bad knee, which of course just made it worse. But he was afraid, and he admitted to this. He was afraid to quit working because he was afraid that he would be replaced, because he knew how easy it was to do it. You know, all you did, you just, okay, get the hook. We're going in a completely different direction, and call us in a year or two. Maybe we can find a job for you. But
everybody feared for their spot, especially in New York. You hear stories of Don Morocco, who talked about he enjoyed working for New York in the summer, but he would always go back to the West Coast or Hawaii in the fall and the winter because he didn't want to go anywhere near the snow. And I don't blame him for that. But once they got into that national expansion era, he was replaceable. And Don knew that, well, if I leave to go back to Hawaii, I'm not going to have a job here when I return in the spring. So that's when Don began working full time there. Or you talk about Paul Orndorff. They did the heel turn on Hogan in 86 into 87. And somewhere in that era, Paul gets a severe nerve injury, like into his neck, down into his arm. And instead of taking the time off to rehab and recover like he was supposed to, he was working Hogan every night, 20,000 people in those arenas. And you can imagine the money on top working Hogan. He was never going to see money like that again. And so no. Paul had the option, go home and recover or continue to make this money. And in short term, he continued to make that money. And unfortunately, that led to the atrophy in his arm. And, all the things that came along with that for the rest of his life after that, he had to deal with it.
Oh, man, I hadn't seen Paul or anything of him. No pictures, nothing, not like seeing Slater on YouTube being arrested again. I never saw anything with Paul until near the time he passed away.
Yeah.
They had a picture of him that was on the internet. I sat to see it. Oh, the guy looked horrible. I mean, compared to what I remembered the guy that Oh, I remember what he looked like when he smacked me in the head with a chair with the wrong, instead of the flat end,
Right.
hit me. The underneath part with the bars and the metal hooks hanging out was the side he hit me with. And I remember how good he looked. That body looked great while he was doing it. But he was having trouble with his left arm even then. And because I did too, I had some of the same problem. No, nowhere near as bad as his. And it's ironic that I'm not sure if that injury came about from his workouts or if it came about from something that happened in his wrestling career that caused that injury or whatever. But I remember it bothering him back when I was working with him at Mid-South. He was already having problems with it. And the guy looked like $1 million. You got to give a guy credit for, nobody gets to look like that without a lot of work.
Right.
So I always admired that, and again, I helped start the guy, teaching him in the very beginning. I didn't do much, just one or two little sessions, but I had some little bit to do with his introduction down there in the snake pit. The only thing I can say about it at all as any credibility or any moment, him and Ron Fuller and Mike Graham, and of course Mike would always be in on those things since Eddie wanted him to, but I don't remember if Brian Blair was there, but Orndorff and Slater I remember definitely. And I was just teaching those guys how to defend themselves. And I mean, this was Graham's idea. I wasn't the one that, I just got called and say, hey, plan on coming down here next Tuesday or whatever. We're gonna work out. I want to work out. Eddie wants you to work out with the guys. And I talked to Graham. They said, yeah, just teach them how to defend themselves against being taken down or things like front face locks or whatever. But the thing, again, I was telling a story, is that I never abused those guys. I didn't have them do 100 push-ups and 500 squats before they ever got in a ring with me. Just to demonstrate your ability, your superiority, and being able to have them do that. I didn't want to abuse the guys because I didn't want them to resent me. I just taught them what they needed to need. With Paul, I was glad to see that he did well up there and with McMahon, because he had his difficulties brought about by his own attitude. In Georgia, he didn't want to go to. He wanted to work in Ohio. This was in the '80s, early '80s, when I was there with Ole. Mm-hmm. He wanted to work in Ohio because you could make, say a couple $1,000s a week the week you worked in Ohio. But then you come back the next week, you work just in Georgia. Well, the Georgia towns are okay. I mean, you had Atlanta, of course, which is a good payoff.
But you also had Rome and Waycross and places like that.
And on Saturday night, you had a place called Savannah, mm-hmm. which was a couple hundred miles from Atlanta, I think. And nobody wanted to make that trip, especially on Saturday night, because you didn't get back into town until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He missed a show. He missed a Savannah. He had tried to get out of it before. He did a deal where he called and said he was sick, and I found out he wasn't, so I had him go down there. He ended up, he didn't work or something anyway, but when Ole found out about it, Ole, this isn't crap on Paul Orndorff, but when I said he had problems, this is what I mean. When Ole found out that he was not going to the show, any show, and Paul was the champion. When Ole found out he didn't make the town, we were in Atlanta at the auditorium. Eddie went in the dressing room, and Paul was halfway through getting dressed. He had his boots on, but Eddie told him to pack up his stuff, and he walked him. He actually had him by the elbow and walked him through the crowd, all the way through the crowd, out to the front door, opened the door, and then shoved him out. But they steered him outside and pulled the door shut and turned around and came back in. You talk about embarrassing, humiliate the guy. But, Paul brought that on himself. We were at the Bayfront one night because it was right next to Tampa, where he went to college and, his hometown, or I don't know if he's from there, but, he'd been around there a lot. He might have been living there at the time. I don't know. But, he was a heel. And I asked him, I didn't ask him. Ole had a fetish where he was going to do a job. and he was complaining. Oh, I don't, he just said, look, I'm not going to do it. It'd be one thing, but it's, oh, Bob, I know these people. I'd look at him like I couldn't believe it. Paul, you're a heel. This is pro wrestling. What are you talking about? It's just hard to believe someone would. Anyway, he created problems for himself.
Well, that goes back to the story where he didn't want a job to dog in Mid-South on TV either.
Yes. Yeah, he screwed himself up there too and cost himself some serious money.
Months. Yeah, you said a couple months of bookings.
Oh, well, I think I made $10,000 and the time I had that was supposed to be his time. But I'm glad he went up there and
he was no doubt a great, he didn't just look great. I mean, he understood how to perform in that ring, and he was certainly a hell of a heel. I mean, they had a baby face run up there, and I dug that as a kid. But talking about a natural heel, that's Paul Orndorff for sure.
Oh, yeah.
One of the greatest to have ever really done it during that era for certain. And again, looked like $1 million. And for anybody wondering, as we're like 20 some minutes into this show, no worries. Even though I didn't put this question out there yet, Paul Orndorff is actually on the list of talent you're going to be asked about. So that all worked in. We went from David Sammartino into Paul Orndorff there, but it works out because that was one of the two names from our next question here.
Yeah, one last thing about Paul. You talk about a contradiction. The guy that would be, like almost whining, oh, Bill, it's going to kill me. If I do a job for dog on TV, it's going to kill me. And kind of doing that whining. Here's this guy looks like $1 million, and like you say, he looked like he could, he could chew nails, and he's like complaining like a little kid. Oh, I know he's going to kill me, and all he's talking to the promoter, the guy who can make or break him, and he's actually insulting Bill by him saying that. But to have that contradiction, and then hear a story like he smacks Van Vader around, right?
Oh yeah, he beat him up in flip flops in the shower, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So I mean, what a contradiction! I see this guy. And again, I never felt threatened by him, and because I wasn't a threat to him, I didn't have any aggressive. He was one of the boys, and last thing I was going to ever do was get into a scuffle with one of the guys, especially at work. If you do it in private, you're out in the lake or something, doing something, you get into a beef. That's one thing, but to do it at work is in the wrestling business. Tele-wrestler, telephone, telegram, everybody in the world knows about it. So, yeah, Paul was a real contradiction in terms to me. When I heard about Van Vader, I thought, man, oh, man. I think back to Paul and say, oh, Bob, it's going to hurt me to get beaten here at Tampa and all that. I thought, my God, what a contradiction in what you see and what you get, how a guy could be so different, in different situations.
Sure. Right.
So... well, it makes him interesting, doesn't it? We're talking about it.
And hopefully that answers one of the two names here on, we had a listener by the name of Mike T. He wrote in and he asked your memories of Paul Orndorff outside of the Mid-South territory. And I totally forgot you would have been there in the early 83 when Paul was the champion working for Georgia. And that's kind of a fun story to work in there and just kind of hear a little more insight into the life and times of Paul Orndorff behind the scenes. Again, one of the greatest talents of that era, no doubt about it. Anywhere he worked, I mean, he stood out. Even in the WWF, that body alone, I mean, he stood out. And so,
well, let me tell the story again, real quick.
Okay,
I'm sorry. Paul called. It was just in Georgia again. This is what led to him getting fired. He called me one morning. He said, and it was Savannah. He said, Bob. He said, I've got the flu. I can't go. And blah 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 blah. I'm sick and all that. And I said, well, can you at least go to the show? Oh, Bob, I'm sick. I don't know. So I said, well, can you get to the town? He said, oh, I can't drive. I'm too sick and all that. So I said, all right, well, I'll get back to you. So I was looking for a way I looked to see what the card was. And Les Thornton was on the card, Les Thornton. So Les and I were buddies. And I called Les and I said, hey, can you, but you're booked tonight in Savannah. Can you take Paul Orndorff with you? He said, yeah. I said, well, you know how to get hold of him? He said, oh, he's out by the pool with me here. Well, he said, I came in to answer the phone. He said, he's out by the pool with me.
Oh
Yeah,
my.
Mister, I'm sick. I've got the flu and all that is out by the pool. So, oh, I was pissed. So, I mean, I wasn't pissed, but I was chagrined. Let's put it that way. So, Paul had to go, and I think maybe that was the one he ended up still not going to that got him fired. But that kind of stuff.
Well, all right. So that was some Paul Orndorff stuff. I like that. We got that out of the way. Mike T. Hopefully, Bob answered that question in regards to some fun stories, some fun memories in the past. But the other name on his list, he asked about Paul Orndorff. He also asked about your interactions or your memories or even your thoughts on Jerry the King Lawler.
Basically, one of admiration, respect of a guy that really took advantage of his talents, his position, his ability to make just a fantastic career for himself. He was always, and a guy who didn't have to work all over the country to do it. He made a living working basically in that Memphis area, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he eventually bought in and became part promoter, but yeah, even from before there, Jerry Lawler was just the king, literally, of Memphis. I mean, outside of Elvis anyway. Lawler was certainly raking in the dough for decades there. How do you stay over in one town for that long, working every Monday night in Memphis, every Tuesday in Louisville, sorry to those Southerners out there, and Wednesday in Evansville, Indiana, and just doing that same loop every week and to be on top for that lengthy period of time. And he would do shots into Georgia, as I'm sure you know. So, yeah, the king definitely got around, but mostly in the Memphis territory until he came to work for Vince in the early 1990s. But Lawler just had a gift of gab like no other. I mean, heel, face, whatever the case may be. We joke about it on my territory show because Lawler wouldn't just come out there and cut his promos for his matches. He would also be the guy that would do kind of like what's going on around the town kind of deal. So he could come out there one segment and say, I'm coming to Monday night. I'm going to cook your ass in a barbecue and throw a fireball, and the crowd's popping, or maybe says something. And then he can come back out the very next segment like a normal human being, go, and we got a charity softball game coming up this Monday. It's hilarious to see what all different aspects Jerry Lawler could bring to the table. And you never questioned it back then. You didn't go, wait a minute, wasn't he just pissed off 10 minutes ago? So it was just, he had the ability to really manipulate in the wrestling world. But on top of that, I found it very fascinating that he could work with anybody. Because if you go back and look at the monsters that he worked, literally the monsters that he booked himself, like Frankensteins and things, but also working with Nick Bockwinkel and Briscoe and Harley Race and everything on down the line. Lawler was able to work with anyone and anything.
Dick the Bruiser.
Yeah.
I saw a match with him and Bruiser, and there was a chain involved somehow. I don't know if it was a chain match or whatever, but I remember a spot. And again, I don't remember a lot of this stuff, but I remember this one because Bruiser was doing something to where he had his back. He was messing with somebody on the apron, and Lawler wrapped that chain around his fist. He had like he's talking about brass knucks. He had an old chain wrapped around his fist, and he ran from behind. Bruiser had his back turned. He ran from behind, and he plastered him in the back of the neck. And I mean, it was a working punch. He didn't. But right. I mean, it looked like Bruiser. You would have thought maybe a fly landed on his neck because he didn't sell it. Oh. He didn't sell it a bit. He didn't sell it nothing. He didn't even register. I never forgot that one. I thought, man, Jerry, I advise you don't do it again. Do something else. Maybe get a flamethrower or something because I don't know what you're going to have to do to get this guy's attention. Yeah. But it worked.
And Lawler, one of Lawler's big deals was throwing that punch. Nobody had a better working punch than Jerry Lawler, I don't think. I don't know if you paid attention to things like that with the guys, like who had the best punch. But as a fan growing up, and even now when you go back and watch, I don't know that anybody ever threw a better working punch than the King. So to hear the story of Bruiser just not even registering the shot, it's believable because it is the Bruiser after all.
Right. Well, the thing with Jerry, you knew that the punch was really something, was the way the crowd responded. They believed it because when he hit you, I mean, of course you need to sell it. There wasn't a big response to the Bruiser's lack of response. Right. It was like, well, what is this? Of course, Bruiser could maybe convince you he was dead from the neck up, that maybe he didn't feel it. But yeah, he was. He was. I mean, that guy's a legend. I remember as a teenager, or preteen even, watching TV up here in Michigan. He was on TV and he did something where everything was in the ring back then. He was the first guy that came out of the ring. I remember he came out of the ring and he took the stairs and broke them. He smashed them onto the concrete or something and broke the stairs and grabbed a board from it or something. You hadn't seen anything. This was in early days. You hadn't seen anything like this.
Right.
So this guy really stood out. It's like I hadn't seen anybody do anything close to that. Guys didn't even go out of the ring. So, he got my attention right away. And again, I couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. And, it's interesting because here I was a kid, and years later I had the good fortune to pick Bruiser up, Dick Atlas. Eddie Graham got us together one time in Fort Lauderdale. We had dinner together, Bruiser and his wife and me and Eddie, but he didn't warm up to me very much. And don't get me wrong, I didn't expect him to. Here's a guy who's seen young guys like me come and go for 40 years, and he's still on top.
Right.
I'm just another new face or whatever. But I was pleased to have dinner with him. I felt like I was in fast company. He was not royalty, but he had been a name for many years.
I mean, he was on that Dumont network back in the 50s.
Yes.
So he was one of the national stars of pro wrestling when wrestling first hit the airwaves. So absolutely.
Yes. So, and I didn't, don't get me wrong. I wasn't like awestruck like a fan would be. I mean,
I got you.
I know that. Yeah. I mean, it was still a work. I don't care what you look like, Dick. If you'd really been crippling people for real, you wouldn't be able to get a match with anybody now. Yeah. And I enjoyed, I was not honored, but I was pleased to have dinner with them. It made me feel like I was in, him and Graham, and both guys who were veterans and all that. And,
sure.
And then later I had a chance to pick him up at the airport and give him a ride somewhere to TV or whatever. And we chatted briefly, he was pleasant enough. I never worked with him. I never worked a match with him that I recall. But again, a great name, hell of a talent. He could work babyface. He would turn babyface against someone like the Sheik, for example, the original Sheik. And, and he would be a great babyface because you needed somebody like him to beat the Sheik, to make you get somebody like the worst heel, or you can turn them babyface and they get over like $1 million for a while. I mean, they're not going to be over as a babyface for long. You can't keep them that way forever. You're going to have to switch them back. But, well, if you're looking for somebody to beat up your top heel and you don't have a babyface that'll cut it, well, you can switch one of your top guys. And if it was Bruiser, you really had somebody who was going to draw a brief. Again, you couldn't do it for long. Yeah, he was a real talent.
Well, that's fun. And we didn't get a question about Dick the Bruiser, but I happen to know a guy here on the WrestleCopia Podcast Network by the name of Dave Dynasty, who is super fan of Dick the Bruiser. So we can pretend like Dave wrote in and ask about the Bruiser here, because I'm sure he is over the moon that you told a couple of Bruiser stories. So, and that's fun to see the Lawler out there, Bruiser out there, no selling the king. It's just funny to envision that.
Yeah, well, thank you, David, for not writing in about that so I could talk about it.
Well, I'm sure he appreciates it nevertheless. So,
hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews. Sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com. And to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Pro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met, from Apple to Spotify, Pocket Cast, and beyond. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of the Grenade Show, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive watch-along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out in the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
We talked about Lawler. We talked about a fun little Dick the Bruiser story there, Paul Orndorff. Let's talk about the Guerreros. Now, you've talked about Gory in the past when we were talking the Amarillo territory, but Gory would spawn off many children that had quite a bit of success throughout their careers. Of course, Chavo Sr., Hector, Mondo, later on Eddie Guerrero as well. He was the pup of that litter. Let's go back. Let's talk the original three, the guys that broke in the 1970s. They worked all throughout the 80s off and on. Chavo was probably, for me, my favorite of those three Guerreros. Certainly one of the most talented wrestlers in the ring, but much like their father, they could do the wrestling side of things and they could do the lucha side of things. And I know you encountered some of these, if not all three of those Guerreros throughout your career. I know Hector, you had to have, worked with, I believe he was even maybe, I don't know if he went through Global, but I know he probably came through Florida when you were booking there in the mid 80s. So tell me your memories of any or all of those Guerreros.
Well, my first contact with them was when I was out there working with the Funks early in my career, the first couple of years in the business. And Chavo was, that would have been in the early 70s. And Chavo was the only one that I believe was, if any of the other younger brothers were active, I wasn't aware of it.
Okay.
I did see Chavo. I mean, I met Gory at El Paso.
Right.
He was a promoter there. We had talked about him before when he brought in the McGuire twins.
Yes.
And he was I say impressive. He was, again, he didn't have time to talk to the talent. He was busy. He was a promoter. He was running a show. And that's the only place I saw him. I don't know what the office. I don't know where the office was in El Paso, if there was one, but
the Guerrero dining room table, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Very likely, it might have been his car. Anyway, I was impressed with especially that show they had where they had El Santo on it. It had a real big house. It was good. It was very exciting. It seemed like to me it was some kind of theater, because I remember the aisles going down to the ring. There was one aisle on both sides of the main seating, just like in a movie theater, or like a theater you have shows on where you have a big stage. Because I remember the McGuire twins walking down the ring, and when they were walking back, they didn't look like they were going to make it up. There was an incline, like in a movie theater, where it's higher at the very back. The seats are higher than at the very front,
right?
So that people in the back can see over the top of the people in front of them. Well, they have that incline of, I don't know, 10 degrees or whatever. Anyway, the shows were good. A lot of Hispanic people, folks in the audience. Nothing untoward. I don't remember, any kind of violence or riot or anything where anything got out of hand. So obviously, Guerrero Sr. had things well in hand to have a good show, and he was smart enough to know that having riots and all that is the worst thing you can do for your business. But I met Chavo, and I was impressed with him. He was kind of quiet, and I never ever was in a car with him alone, or even in a dressing room alone with him where I ever had a private conversation. So, but I did admire his talent. And the other thing is, after looking at it now, I admire the fact that the Guerrero family created a legacy of the family of Gory Sr. with all his boys, of guys who went out there, and not all the stories are positive. There's always some negative somewhere in the group, misfortune and tragedy. But basically, a family where the guys did well. Again, you have things get involved sometimes. I think there was maybe some drug problems with one or two of the guys. But later on, I'm talking about in the last 10 years, my son Kyle and I I don't remember exactly where, but we picked up which one of the younger brothers would still be active now.
Chavo Jr.
We picked him up and gave him a ride somewhere, and Kyle was sitting in the back seat with him. He got in a conversation with my son Kyle, and he was very nice. Kyle he's kind of quiet, and he was he was enough pleasant where Kyle felt comfortable enough to have a conversation with him, and Kyle liked him, and that impressed me, because a lot of the boys, they don't bend over backwards to be congenial to family members. So I think that by and large, I'm not someone who's real familiar with everything that happened in their history, but by and large, I think the story is a positive one. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that, they brought that lucha style to the States. They did a lot of things that nobody else had saw by that point in the 70s and even in the 1980s, watching those guys perform. And then, of course, Eddie pops up by the end of the 80s, the story goes, he works one match on TV for the WCW in 1989. And wouldn't you know who brought him in? But Terry Funk suggested, why don't you give this Eddie guy a try? And Terry Funk works Eddie and tries to put him over on, not do the job, but actually just make him look good there on the 605, the TBS program, the Saturday night program. And obviously Eddie's really young and green at that point. He doesn't get a job with the company, but he would live to fight another day and become a mega star later on in WCW and the WWE before, passing away very early in his life. But yeah, the Guerreros were always something to me. I always enjoyed getting a kick out of watching them come around town if they were going to be on TV this week. If Vern Gagne was bringing one of them in, whatever the case may be, oh man, there's a Guerrero on the screen. So I would say that they certainly set a precedent for a new type of wrestling. I think here in the States was what they brought to the dance overall. But my favorite was Chavo, I think, out of the original group. But Hector was around probably the longest of those. I think Hector kind of lingered on. I don't know when he started. I don't know their ages without going and looking them up, but Hector seemed to stick around a little longer than Chavo did working full time. And so that might have been somebody you came in contact with more often was Hector, but I was just going to get your take if you had any memories of any of the Guerreros. So
I think I might have worked with some of them. Hector.
I would have to imagine at some point. It's like,
yeah. And you know what, because I don't remember, that means the matches went well.
Sure.
And I do remember that Chavo was kind of, I don't want to say cold, but he was kind of quiet, and Hector was more outgoing and friendly and exuberant. And,
I've heard stories that Chavo was a little harder to deal with than some of the others. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he wasn't. I never put myself in a position with him to be rebuffed or snubbed or disrespected. Sure. I never had an opportunity. Not that I didn't want to, but it just never came up. But I gotta, if after all these years, if there haven't been like a bunch of horrible stories about some of the things that we've had to talk about, then it's hopefully it's a good thing. I mean, you can't be in the wrestling business for a lifetime without having some negative thing happen to you. If it's when your career starts to wind down, and how that transpires, how that happens. Is it some way that you leave on a high note, or do you go out go back to poor Paul Orndorff? I don't know what his last years in the business were like, but I do know what that picture I saw of him shortly before he passed away. I recognized the face, but nothing else on him. I had a memory of him back like the time he hit me with a chair when all the muscles were in action, right, and rippling and being pulled, and so he smacked me with that chair. And here's a guy that looks like not even a shadow of himself, So
yeah, he had some pretty bad health issues there near the end, unfortunately, right?
Well, it's a shame, and I don't wish that on anybody.
No, right.
Well, even if you wish things like that on your worst enemy, if you're carrying that stuff around your head,
that's not a good thing.
No, it's not a good thing.
It's not good for your soul. Whether you believe in the afterlife, whether you believe in God or not, whether you believe in a soul, it's still not good for your soul to hold that in you. It's just not good for your own body, your own health.
Well, think about this. If you got somebody that you really despise and you keep them in your head, it's like they own you. All you have to do is think of them and you're in a bad mood.
It's what they call living in your head rent-free nowadays.
Yes, yes. And why would you give somebody like that? Why would you let them in? You wouldn't let somebody that in your house. You're not welcome in my house. Why would you have them in your head? Yeah. And what you have to, I've had to train myself and work on it with positive thinking and biofeedback and a bunch of meditative study, karma and fate and all kinds of different philosophies to say no. Don't be carrying this kind of stuff around with you. I put things in boxes, even figuratively, shoving them down in my subconscious. But I try to get rid of stuff mentally. So just a mental exercise. I put stuff in boxes that are impossible to open, and I send them out into space, and it works. Within a year or two, I don't even ever think of stuff again. It's just gone. Wow. And this has happened since we started. I'm a much happier person today than I was when you and I started on this podcast. And the podcast has something to do with it, but the main thing was getting my head in order. I had been involved in extracurricular events and politics, the point where I had made myself miserable. And I decided, hey, life's too short. I mean, I've got 82 years in, but I'm not ready, every day is a new, I'm not used to being this old, and right. Every day is a new experience. And I know there's no reason for it to end. I'm in good health, reasonably good health, for someone who, it's funny, you tell doctors, you get a new doctor, you tell them some of the things you've done in your life, they look at you and go, man, why aren't you in a coffin somewhere? You shouldn't, I don't know how you managed to survive all the stuff you talked about.
Right.
I remember one guy in Houston, a doctor, he said, well, do you drink? I said, yeah. He said, well, how much do you drink? I said, probably a 6-pack a night. He went, oh my God. Yeah, what? What? Yeah,
Oh my
and
my.
yes. And I said, yeah. I said, I work, and usually I sweat. And so when I could drink a 6-pack of beer and I don't even feel intoxicated. I'm just replacing, I like the taste of beer, and I'm replacing fluid, the bodily fluid. The guy looked at me like I was a raving alcoholic. And I tried to think, man, you think I'm bad? I know guys that drink two 6-packs every night, and that's just in the car driving back from the show. And then once they get back, if it's early enough, they go in the bar for a few hours. So, no, my little 6-pack, these guys are not just doing a 6-pack or two. They're also doing pot, speed, downers, uppers, in-betweeners, and whatever else. So,
Eventually it would take its toll on some of the guys later on, some of the things they were messing with. But yeah, your era specifically, you hear tell of everybody just riding up the road, getting plowed, and just, you know, making the towns anyway and getting back home. I'm so surprised there weren't more car accidents and deaths in the wrestling business than there actually were, you know.
Right.
But,
well, one of the circumstances that contributed to that was that in the evening after the show, there wasn't that much traffic, you know, on the highways.
At night, right? Yeah, especially back then.
Yeah, coming back from shows, not going to shows.
Because we didn't have a lot of all these damn stores and things popping up and staying open late night and things. So there was really no reason to be on the roads, long trips on the roads like that back then. So I could see where there would be a lot less traffic. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, but you're right. But especially some of the way that, I got a Lawler story.
All right.
Go back to Jerry Lawler for a second.
Let's do it.
Jerry was working in Florida, but there was a guy who worked as a referee. I think he'd been a wrestler too. And he was from, I think he was from the Memphis area, because I don't want to say stuck, but somehow I ended up getting a ride back from, Fort Lauderdale. I believe it was Fort Lauderdale, back to Tampa. We were on the coastal high, not an interstate, but there was a state road, I think it's 60, that there's canals on both sides of the road for like 70, 80 miles. Mm-hmm. And there's a place in between Tampa and Miami called Yeehaw Junction. And we were in the area coming from Fort Lauderdale back towards Yeehaw Junction. So I'm sitting in the back seat, and there's no traffic. You can see the canal on both sides with headlights. You can see, you can't really see the water because it's dark, but you can see that there's something. You can see where the road and the earth, the side of the road ends. Mm-hmm. On both sides. Well, there is a lane, a shoulder on both sides where you could pull over if you needed to. And so we're going along, and I don't know if the driver was trying to impress me or what. I don't know what they did, but he turned the lights off, and he sped up, and he was going like, I don't know, 70, 80 miles an hour. And he and Lawler kept looking back at me, and the driver's looking back at me in the mirror. I guess they were waiting for me to, freak or whatever. I didn't say anything. I thought, well, you're nuts. But then that didn't get a reaction from me. He went off on his shoulder, and it wasn't like grass and all that. It was kind of a solid shoulder. He's still going 80, 90 miles an hour. He's looking at me in the mirror, but his eyes aren't on the road. And Lawler's looking out. They're sitting in the front seat. And Lawler's in the passenger side. He's looking back at me. At the very last second, they're both looking at me. The guy whips back on the road. What neither one of them saw was that there was a black car parked on the shoulder. And when he went back on the highway, the car was not more than like 20 feet away. He didn't see it. But I mean, you talk about seeing your life. I mean, it was too quick. But I couldn't even convince them that there'd been a car there. They thought I was just doing sour grapes. But that referee was a guy that ended up later dying in an automobile accident. I can't
Sam
think of his
Bass.
name. Yeah. Was that the guy
that was Lawler's manager in Memphis for the longest? Yeah.
Yeah, that's who it was. I wasn't I wasn't surprised. I mean, of course, I wasn't. I was unhappy to hear it, but I wasn't surprised because you can't do that kind of crap. You know, I mean, what do you got, a death wish? I was just amazed that Lawler put up that kind of crap. You know, I mean, he had a very valuable asset in himself.
Right.
So yeah, boy, I never was going to get in a car with either one of those guys again. But yeah, that one of those moments in time where, you know what, the only way that you could, if you could project through hypnosis, if you could project like they do in sci-fi movies, if you could project what somebody actually saw through hypnosis, I could go back and produce that car. But otherwise, you know, they still don't believe me. They wouldn't, you know, Jerry might not believe it to this day that there was a car there. They didn't believe it then. They thought I was, again, doing sour grapes. But I didn't say much. I didn't say much the rest of the way back. And as soon as we got there, I got out of the car, said thank you, and I never again. Oh man. Wow. So yeah, and you know, that Jerry to me was the soul of being a businessman, and that kind of activity, that kind of stuff, just goes totally contradictory towards being safe and you know, smart. You can't be much of an athlete if you're crippled. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been. I think Lawler was in Florida in '75, so this Sam Bass passes away in '76 in an automobile accident. So it wasn't, but maybe a year later, not even a year later. So that's crazy to think to hear that story. I really wasn't expecting that one. So very interesting. That's definitely a new one.
Oh man, yeah. Well, you know, the things you remember. Why would you remember them? Because they are exceptional. I never saw anything close to my death. I mean, I had a seatbelt on, but I don't know. He was going 80, 90 miles an hour, hitting a parked car. I mean, you're going to seriously, those guys will both be dead. I don't know what would have happened to me, but couldn't going to be anything good. I got some other stories, so we could get down there. I might have already told the one about the two Australian boys on that same road swimming in the canal with alligators. But we'll get back to that one.
Yeah, well, I'm going to mark that down here because I don't remember that off the top of my head. I'm going to try to see if I recall a story about swimming with alligators or not. But we've got some more names to get into here. But before we get into the names, again, guys, if this takes 3 weeks, we're going to do this for 3 weeks, the Ask Bob routine. So I'm going to try to get in as many questions as we can, Bob. Lots of listeners wanting lots of things answered here, but go ahead.
Let me say something, Ray.
Sure.
Let me apologize, dear listener out there. Do not blame my partner and guide here, Mr. Ray Russell, is not the one that's going on at length, ad nauseum. That's Windbag Bob. So Ray is trying real hard to get the program he had lined up is what he's trying to get done. I just happen to get in here, and if I can't stick my foot in my mouth at least once every half hour, I'm not happy. So I have to keep trying. So bear with me, but don't blame Ray. It's all the blithering is on my part.
Okay, well that's fair, I guess, if you want to take one for the team there, Bob. But we've got they're asking questions, you're giving answers, and if you can come up with another story in between, I'm not going to stop you. So it's interesting to hear stories like the Dick the Bruiser story or Sam Bass, guys I didn't even think would come up today. It's pretty cool. It's another piece of history. Here's a question sent in by Rick Davidson, and it's kind of worded wonky. Sorry, Rick, but I'm going to try to reword this because I do remember you mentioning this in passing, and we never went back to revisit it. Back a while ago, we covered your time in the Mid-South Territory working for Bill Watts. It was a 4-part episode. Everybody go back and check those out. Really fun time. But somewhere in one of those episodes, I do recall this as well, Rick brings up that just in passing, you mentioned that you had an opportunity to potentially take over the booking job in the Mid-South, but you blew that job with Bill Watts, and we never went back to revisit why that was. Do you remember mentioning that or what that was about?
What happened, I had mentioned earlier that I went up for, on TV day, I always went up into the room where Bill was handing out finishes. Mm-hmm. He did it in private, he was off by himself. I would go up there. It was a big room. It was like 30 feet long, and there was a bench running along the wall, all along the wall, and I went and sat down at the far end where I was kind of trying to be unobtrusive, but I could listen and hear what was going on and what Bill was coming up with for his TV shows. And after showing that interest for, I wasn't auditioning for the job, but after showing that interest, Bill had mentioned it to me, and I indicated that I'd be interested. Well, we were going to be working wherever we were going. We had to get on a plane to do it. Do you remember where he lived? Where was his home?
Bixby, Oklahoma.
Well, I was at his house that night, the night of the show. So what big town is anywhere near there?
The main town they ran there was Tulsa. I couldn't tell you how close that is to Bixby. I'm not an Oklahoman, but it was likely Tulsa, I'm assuming.
Well, what happened. I was hanging around with the Samoans, Afonseca a little bit, and we were on a plane, and to me it was like the only time, other than in my private life, only time I was on a plane that whole year. So it was like a holiday in a way. The Samoans had given me something, some kind of, and I had mentioned earlier.
Something.
Well, I mentioned earlier that it was in Moreau, afternoon show, and the guys were sitting at a big table. Our two, Junkyard Dog and Jake the Snake, were sitting across from each other at this big, like a poker table, like 4 or 5 feet across, circle, in a circular table. And they got into a talk about drugs, and Dog pulled out this Haig and Haig, that purple blue bag with a drawstring, and he opened it up and he poured it out on a table, and there was 8 or 9 different kinds of things. There was some kind of, it looked like hash, big ball of hash, and some kind of aluminum foil, and you could see the tobacco, whatever, kind of leaking out of it, and all kinds of pills and bottles and different kinds of stuff. And then Jake pulled out his, and he poured it on the table, and there was like, 500 pills of different kinds, all mixed together, all pills. And meanwhile, this attracted all the wrestlers. And Kerry Von Erich, Jimmy Garvin, I can't think of who else. And, I was thinking, well, I didn't know that the drug, acknowledging your drug use was acceptable there. I had no idea that it was that. I couldn't believe it, because Ernie Ladd was the booker. He was sitting about 4 feet, 5 feet away with his back to us, looking at his book. He was doing something, and I leaned around and looked to see I could see what he's doing. I thought, well, God, isn't he interested about all this? He was rolling a joint. And then Grizzly Smith walked in. He's the guy running the show. He's the direct link to Watts. He's Watts' eyes and ears. And he walks in, and Jake is his son. That's kind of a mixed, screwed up relation, but
sure.
So I'm thinking, well, what's he going to think about this? And he's just looking down. He's not even shaking his head like my, oh, you naughty boys. He's just looking down like, oh yeah. And I thought, my God, you talk about being open.
Right.
Jake was on purpose was dating a nurse, and she was getting him these drugs, and Dog just. People would give Dog anything he wanted. I can only
imagine. Yeah, Dog probably just walked down the street and get anything he wanted. Yeah.
Well, you never saw it with either one of them. I got a story. We'll get some stories about Jake with drugs, but I forgot where we were going with it.
Well, you often seek on a plane.
Oh yeah. They gave me something. I don't remember exactly what it was. Some kind of pill, and I took it. And whatever it was too strong. We had a layover. We were waiting for either a connecting flight or for a bus or something. Somebody did something in the airport and grabbed one of the Samoans' headband or something and took off with it. And like an idiot, I took off after him. And, here I am running around an airport. And then, I got 30 feet down the aisle or down the hallway, and I realized what I was doing. I stopped. But that kind of got Bill's attention. And then I got really, I wasn't reeling around. I wasn't staggering. I worked my match and everything, but whatever this pill was, this drug was strong, and you could tell, And so Bill called me in that night, and he told me, he said, I'd been considering you for a booker, but I can't, with this lapse on your part, I can't do it. Which is, and I was embarrassed, of course, and ashamed of myself, but, in retrospect, it worked out because we never talked about it, but working for Bill and working for Ole were two completely different things. Bill never considered me a peer, and yet Ole did. Even as powerful and as influential on the business. If you think about it, Ole with TBS was a much bigger deal than Bill Watts was.
Sure.
Now Watts, don't get me wrong, Bill was, he made a fortune out there with this.
He had a good thing going, no doubt.
Yeah. And Bill always struck me as being an island unto himself, and he wasn't going to let anybody else on the island. Mm-hmm. And Ole was willing to. And Ole wasn't a big hell fellow. Well, Matt, he wasn't always, hey, how you doing? He was, he hadn't seen you in a week.
Not Ole.
Yeah, he was, but he did. Here we are in a business that, we're in a business that everything's a work, everything is manipulation. And Ole didn't mess around. He didn't pretend. He didn't go, he might, you hadn't seen him a week or whatever. He'd come in, he just wouldn't say, hey, how you doing? He'd just say, okay, what's this? What's that? Whatever I was coming to see him about, we start talking about that. And I kind of like that because there was no ceremony. There was no status involved. There was no protocol that had to be followed. I kind of enjoyed that. It was like one-on-one. I never felt one-on-one with Bill. I felt that Bill, and don't get me wrong, he had every right to think that way. He was an exceptional, the guy was very, very smart. He's a millionaire and many times over, I think, and I'm not. In a business where that's the main reason for being in it. Anybody, people, you ask them, what were you in it? I think 9 out of 10 guys will say for the money. I had many people say the only reason to be in this business and be on the road and be gone all the time and miss your anniversaries and birthdays and miss your family growing up and all that is to make a lot of money. And if you aren't making a lot of money doing it, then you're wasting your time. But I never agreed with that. I was doing it my own reasons, but I screwed up myself. But in retrospect, it worked out because I'm here. I'm here where I am today.
Yeah, you worked for several years in Georgia with Ole, and then Ole even called you back to come work again in WCW. Yeah. So yeah, it paid off to make the move. And hey, you still have that run in Mid-South. It's a lot of it's out there. It's the 82 portion anyway, from the beginning of December 81 through when you leave in the summer of 82. All of that's out there. It's documented on the TV program anyway. So there's a lot of it. The footage exists. And so Bob Roop was part of that big era there with DiBiase and JYD and Paul Orndorff and Orton. And just, oh my God, the list goes on and on. The Samoans and yeah, good stuff. But I always wanted to go back to that. So I'm so glad one of the listeners wrote in and asked about that because I was trying to figure out a way to get back to that. And then I forgot about it. And so, that's a very cool story. Maybe not cool, but very interesting to see how it all went down. But I get it from a business perspective. Cowboy thinking, well, I don't know if I can trust you in this position. I don't know, I don't notice, these things go on often, but if you're capable of doing these things, I can't have it happen on the wrong day. And right. So I totally get that. Looking back at it now, let's juxtapose these two stories. There's a table. If the table is, say, 10 square feet, about 3 square feet of it is filled with drugs, illegal drugs. Because I kind of look at it too is Bill Watts was notorious for laying down fines and things like that on the wrestlers. Buddy Landell knew that more than anybody, but I don't know that he was like super happy that these guys were doing all of these substances and whatnot. But I think you talk about, well, I can't let you be the booker, Bob, because you may have some issues here. Meanwhile, of all people, Grizzly Smith, what a human being, if you want to call him that, that guy was. You hear the stories of what he was, like in the dark side, and all the stories that came out long before the dark side of that family there. But Grizzly Smith was his right-hand man. So of all people to, entrust so many things, and not that Grizz, I don't know his drug habits, though he may have had a few, but just some of the other things that he was into, if you will. Just unbelievable that Bill Watts had to have known something about it and just, continued on with that. So it's very curious who he surrounded himself with and who he didn't.
Wow. Well, you just open up a complete, it's like a Madison Square Garden or where there's a big stage and the curtain just opened up on a whole new scenario. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that Bill would work with Grizzly, knowing, and I mean, all the stuff about Grizzly and his personal proclivities towards.
It didn't sound like he hit him. I guess back in that era, you didn't need to hide it as much as, later on, sad to say, it seemed like things went on back then that I don't want to say they were okay, because they absolutely weren't. But at the same time, it was just like people just kind of let people do their own thing back in those days.
Well, a lot of the stuff that Grizzly was doing was not just horrible stuff. It was immoral, really immoral, and doing damage.
It's absolutely disgusting.
Disgusting and doing damage to human beings. And the fact that you support someone who's doing that.
Right.
Not only support them, but make a living for them. You're abetting that behavior in a way. And also by having him on the road all the time, Watts was almost like sorry, Bill, but Watts was almost like a contributor. He was making it a lot easier for Grizzly to do his horrible stuff that he was, stuff he was doing with in his personal life.
That's just crazy, man.
Oh, it is. Well, it's funny. You look at people who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, but we can look at history and get new realizations all the time. I just got a whole new, I'm talking about a whole big screen opening up and looking at something from a completely different point of view, because, you know what? I'm not apologizing for this, Bill. For Bill Watts to get down on me for getting high one day when it's almost, I think it was a Sunday. But,
you can't be doing that in the Bible Belt, Bob.
Yeah. To get on me for that when he's supporting a pedophile and I don't know what else. Now all of a sudden, Bill, maybe there's a little bit of hypocrisy involved here. It's okay to have a guy running your show. The guy running the show, you get to go everywhere. You're in the box office. You're in the dressing room. You're out in the audience. You have I did that for Ole. You have carte blanche. You could be everywhere, anywhere in the building.
Sure.
In Cleveland, I used to go, I had a job in Cleveland. Well, there were 15 different ways to get into the Cleveland Coliseum or auditorium, whatever it was called. There was all these different ways you could get in the building without coming through the front gate and buying a ticket. And one of my jobs was to go and be shutting these places down and keeping people from getting in, locking the door, or finding some way to block things. And so, but what I'm saying is, I had carte blanche, and so did Grizzly Smith. So he had time to, if he was looking for victims for his particular proclivities, if he was looking for people to act out his behavior on, Watts provided the perfect environment for him to do it. Maybe I'm even, you know what? Think about it. I'm even happier that I didn't get the job. Think about it. I would have been out there working with Grizzly Smith all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I wasn't, because if you're around someone who's doing that kind of stuff and you know about it, and you just continue to go on with it, you're in a sense partially responsible.
Yeah.
You're an accessory in a sense. And I didn't want to be that. Ole wasn't like that. Ole was a very moral person compared to that. He didn't do drugs. He didn't drink. He wasn't a hellraiser. He wasn't a skirt chaser.
Ole was straightforward. He was abrasive, but in general, he did things, I don't want to say the right way, but I mean, more so just he was a businessman and he got shit done, basically. It was Ole. And man, it's kind of interesting to think about.
Well,
All right, we'll go on. Another user, this one from Twitter, or X as they call it now, Mike, a.k.a. Tony Donut. He wrote in, question for Bob. He said, you got to love these names. He said, what makes a good working punch? And what are some of the best ways to practice the art of a working punch? Good question. I've heard different wrestlers, Ric Flair, Jerry Lawler, they've all explained how they practice that art, that work punch to where it looks basically real without actually clocking the guy. And, I don't know if it was Lawler or Flair that talked about punching at a string that was hanging there until the string didn't move. I mean, I've heard variations in different styles and ways guys worked. Some guys just said it became natural, or I did it from working in the ring or whatever. What was your way of doing it, Bob? And also, what other ways do you know about that seem to be the right way to go about learning how to throw a punch without actually hitting the guy, so to speak?
Well, the first punching, I didn't do punching until I did clubbing. I would club a guy on the side of the head with my hand, not the fist part, but like with the fingers bent, with the bottom of my hand, with your hand flat. You can take your close one fist and beat it into the palm of the other hand, and you don't feel anything really hard in that hand. So I would club him on the side of the neck, and I wouldn't make the wind up and the punch a lot stronger than when I actually hit him. I wasn't putting my weight behind it. So, and then as far as hitting with the fist itself, and that just came from experience. I didn't do any. I mean, yes, I practiced hitting walls and all, hitting at a wall and that stuff like that. But in my case, it just seemed to evolve. And I didn't do a lot of punching. If you punch a guy, I'd like a guy, if I'm going to punch him, I want him to react. And I thought it was an expose in a way to hit a guy. You hit a guy like I'm thinking about Dick Murdoch. Dick Murdoch can hit you right in the nose, right between the eyes, right on the chin, and look like it landed. It looked like he hit you. Mm-hmm. But the nose doesn't bleed. The mouth doesn't bleed. The eye doesn't swell up. So that punch isn't really all that powerful, is it? Again, we're used to having people suspending their disbelief is what we do, just like in a movie. Suspend your disbelief and get with the program. Whatever is going on here, you can only go so far before people say, "Wait a minute, he hit that guy 15 times," and I know the Sheik stabbing Mr. Wrestler Tim Woods in the mask, right, 10 times with the bladder opener or whatever, and no blood. Blatant expose. Now, what I'm talking about is much less than that. But you hit a guy with a punch that looks like it ought to kill him, and it doesn't. 10 seconds later, he's going to be giving you a small package or doing something where he's going to come back. You don't want to hit him with a great punch at that time. I would save my best punching for when I had a gimmick on my hand, what looked like brass knuckles, which usually was just some tape around something. So,
even though you practiced a little, it really just came with just learning curve, basically just being out there doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Rank time. Let's put it this way. I don't remember taking the time to hit a string or anything like that. It just seemed to evolve. And again, I didn't do a lot of punching because as a heel, I remember working with guys, Heinz Schmidt, kick and punch and stomp. That's all he did. You get someplace where you go 45 minutes. I worked with him somewhere out of St. Louis at a spot show, a little high school gym or something. 45 minutes, he must have kicked and punched me 200 or 300 times. I should have been bleeding from everything, from my toenails, and there wasn't a mark on me. So to me, it's just and here's what happens. It gets to a point where the audience just isn't believing it. You're not getting a reaction. They're humming, but they're not. It's just because there's something going on. It's not like let's contrast something. Johnny Valentine getting Jack Briscoe in a front face lock and kicking him down in the middle of the ring for 10 minutes. Well, it's not a lot of yelling and screaming going on during that 10 minutes either. But they're watching. Completely different than 10 minutes Hans Schmidt kicking me and punching me and, gouging me and running my head in the turnbuckle and looking like I should be bleeding from everything again, every pore in my body, and yet nothing. I'm not going to have a mark on me. With one, even though there's nothing happening, Valentine's got a hold out in the middle of the ring. Nothing's going on. Jack's kicking his feet a little bit, but nothing really happening. But people intent are watching that. With the other, with our match, you saw the first minute. It's the same as the 45th minute. The same thing's happening. And what's happening wasn't interesting the first time. It's damn sure not interesting now because you know what? With Schmidt, I'd have to come back. He just had to. You couldn't let him beat on you for 20 minutes straight. You had to come back. So he'd beat on me, I'd come back. He'd beat on me, I'd come back. We had like 9 matches, in 45 minutes. And by the time you come back for the third or fourth time, it means absolutely nothing. So, yeah, sometimes less is more. I could get a lot of heat in matches by setting up where I have 4 or 5 opportunities to punch a guy. And in the past, I had used that same opportunity to punch the guy. But in this case, I don't do it. And I convinced everybody that I've turned over a new leaf. I'm letting the audience know, hey, I'm, through gesture and action, whatever, that I'm going to be fair today. I don't need to punch or anything to beat this guy. I'm going to wrestle fair. After about 10, 15 minutes, when they're really into it, then when I sucker punch the guy and he sells it and goes down, and it doesn't need to be a brass knuckles, but it's a real punch, and he goes down, then I've got some serious heat, and it's just one punch instead of 50 or 100. And that was my philosophy about punching.
Right.
Because Valentine said it himself, and I always follow the same philosophy. Anything that you're doing that's not getting over, you should quit doing it. If you do something that looks great and nobody's buying it, quit doing it because you're not getting any response to it. Mm. So find the things that do work.
Well, all righty. There you go. And less is more, says Bob, when you throw in the punches. And my grandfather would agree because when I first started watching wrestling, say 5 years old, 4 or 5, whatever the heck I was, just off and on here and there, it was cute. Aw, I found another thing I like to watch on TV besides cartoons. But as I became obsessed with wrestling, I think it sickened my grandfather a little bit because he didn't watch it, but he also was like, this kid needs to do other things, right? Besides watch wrestling. So he, every once in a while, not very often, but every few months, he might walk through the room when I'm watching it. And he would love to point out, look at him, sit there and punch him 10 times. He ain't got a mark on his face. So he would try to break the reality that I was living in. Wrestling is fake is what he was trying to tell me.
Right.
And that was like one of his main go-tos was, how do you punch a guy 10 times and they don't have a mark on him and he's still standing and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, when you look at it from an outsider's point of view versus a fan that suspending their disbelief, I totally get where you're coming from with that. We're going to try to get in a couple more questions here, guys, this week, Bob.
Sure.
Nito Gomez from the West Coast out there. Hopefully you're out there safe. Not sure where Nito's at over there in California, but we know there's a lot going on right now. But he wrote in, he asked a couple of questions. So we're going to get one in this week and we'll try to get the other one in next time. He asks, when you worked in the Roy Shire, San Francisco territory, what part of the Bay Area did you live in? And did you feel the territory was fairly easy to drive to each city from town to town?
I lived in Fremont. I think that's the name of it. I talked about, I didn't live in San Francisco proper, but I talked about spending some time when Chris Colt and I were hanging out. I stayed at his apartment in downtown San Francisco a few times.
Okay.
So I knew I stayed over, I spent the weekend there. I spent probably just one night where if I went to sleep there, it would be just one night. But it wasn't my apartment, but I knew what it was like to, live in one. In my own apartment, Fremont. That was, it was, what it was private. And it wasn't something where a lot of wrestlers lived in the same apartment complex or whatever. I found a private place. The the farthest town was Fresno. It was a couple hundred miles. I remember because I got the booking job. Smirnoff and I were driving, and he was driving. That's right. He was driving for some reason. He was driving my car, and we had to go through a toll. It was like 50 cents. I gave him a $10 bill. He handed it to the toll taker. he said, "Keep the change," and he took off.
Oh my!
Yeah, left $9.50 of my money with the guy. I had to laugh. I mean, it's a good rib. But anyway, we got to Fresno that day, and I'd been drinking rum because I was getting ready to give my notice. That's why I remember. This is what makes Fresno memorable for anybody going out there saying, "Well, wait a minute, Bob. Geez, I just asked you a question. Now you're off a complete different tangent." No, I'm talking about why I remember Fresno so well was because that's where I got the booking job with Shires. That gave it special moment. If I'd have gotten it in San Mateo or in San Francisco at the Cow Palace, I would remember that for that reason, but it was in Fresno. And that wasn't that bad a trip. It wasn't like going through a bunch of small towns, having to stop a lot. There was interstates. Traveling in California was always, to my mind, most of the trips were short. It was a great territory. That's why I wanted to be, to have to
stay out there, promote out there.
Well, I mean, look at Pat Patterson. Pat stayed out there all those years, bought a house. He had a life. He could, you talk about being in hog heaven. It was his personal proclivities. He had paradise out there for 20 years, and for wrestlers to have that kind of a environment that they can work and live and have a life at the same time, have a personal life, where I actually have a house that they can develop and build and decorate and everything the way they want to, and actually have a place they're going to have spend some time. A lot of times wrestlers, when you go to territories, you don't buy a house, you get an apartment because you're going to find out.
You never know how long you're going to be there.
Exactly. And the thing is, usually whatever the place is, you're not in that place that much. You're gone a lot. You're gone all the time. So it's just a place to walk in, lock the door where you have some privacy and go to bed, or go to get some sleep or have dinner or whatever. But you didn't spend that much time there. Where you lived in the wrestling business, like Knoxville was another one, where you had short trips and you could be your home a lot. So you could have a home. You could have your own home and have time to enjoy it.
In San Francisco, you also talked about you could enjoy the sun, and at the same time, you could go skiing if you wanted to. It was close enough to us. So there was a lot to do. And again, like you say, the short trips from San Francisco across the bay to Oakland and all the little towns in between. And yeah, Fresno is a little further away than the rest, but in general, it does seem like short trips, and you've put it over in the past. You really enjoyed that territory for the ability to live a life like you did in Knoxville to a degree. So I think that answers that. And Nito is a longtime super fan, but also I would consider him to some degree somewhat of a historian of the San Francisco territory. He grew up, a kid watching wrestling there, but he also would go around even as a teenager and sell the programs in the venues and things.
Wow.
So so he goes back a lot. Yeah, to a degree, selling the programs for Alan Bolte, who was the ring announcer at that point in time. So
right. Well, no, a guy that was doing that, think about it. He gets to walk around the venue, and you're almost like, if you're selling things in the audience, you're almost invisible. But you're like, we talked about Grizzly having the wherewithal to be wherever he wanted to be. Well, the same thing, if you're selling things to the audience, you had a chance to be all over the place. You could see what was going on, as opposed to somebody who came in and got a ringside seat. All they're going to see most of the time, most of the night, is what's going on right in front of them. So that made a big difference. Yeah, you could, in San Francisco, you could go to the beach in the morning, drive up to Tahoe, and you could go snow skiing. And then you could come down from snow skiing and you could go out and go water skiing all the same day. Now, that's a nice place to be. That's a nice place to work.
Just let your body adjust in between, guys. That's all I can recommend.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Nito does have another question. We will save that for the next episode. Ron Kirkman wrote in. He sent us a few questions. We read a couple of them last week. So we're going to save those for next week as well, since he already got a couple. And I'm trying to be fair to everyone out here.
Of course.
We've got a couple more names here. People wanting to hear your take on the Destroyer, Dick Beyer, Jose Lothario. So I'm trying to find one more question to wrap things up this week. Wiley Gene Beard, I have not forgotten about you. And William Jett, I see your questions are here as well. We're going to save those for next week. So let's close up with this question here from Rick Fields. He writes in, he says, I remember when ICW, that's the PAFO territory, was at, of all places, Falling Rock, West Virginia, in the spring of 1980 or 81. I was in the front row. It was a high school gym that was packed. Their show was on WOAY out of Oak Hill. Falling Rock is around an hour or so from Oak Hill, 20 minutes north of Charleston. He says, looking back, what a lineup. The only names not on the card were Randy Savage and Ron Garvin. But little Herbert Hoover High School still got Bob Roop, Bob Orton, Pez Watley, the one-man gang, Lanny Poffo, George Weingroff, Sword and Vines. They just ran once here, however, in Falling Rock, West Virginia. So Rick Field's question is, how many of these one-off spot shows did ICW run? Was it common for Angelo Poffo to randomly find a town like, Falling Rock, run one show there and just kind of move on?
I really don't know his MO in terms of how he did that. I'm just surmising here. This is just a guess that maybe if he would if he had, say, done a Rolling Rock, or he'd done a show like this, and said, oh, hey, we did great. We got sold out. Now, maybe the sellout would be only like $2,000, which, I mean, but that's not Miami or Atlanta or whatever. It's a spot show. But even if you sell out, that's great, no matter how big it is. But if you go, he went back and said, well, we went back a month later and it was half a house, which just, you don't even hardly break even.
Right.
So, I do remember a lot of spot shows because they didn't have. We talked about this last week, I think. They didn't have a regular Lexington or and then a Knoxville.
They didn't have a weekly loop.
No,
I got you.
Didn't have a loop. In a sense, that might have been a portent of doom or of going out of business, of not being able to establish towns because
just trying to find the gaps to fill. Okay, we got Friday. Let's go find a city somewhere. That's got to be. That's got to really wear you out mentally as well.
All the thing that goes into it. Yeah, you've got to. If you're Angelo Poffo and Randy, whatever the brain trust was, you can't do it yourself. You have to have somebody to go to that town to put up posters. You have to make sure you get, hopefully get radio, get ads on radio and TV. All that has to be done. In a lot of cases, I mean, when we were working opposition to Fuller, we ran some of these little towns, and we would have, remember, Tony Peters would be one of the ones that would go up and put up posters in towns on telephone poles and storefronts to try to get, and to try to advertise shows. And but without TV, we never did have much success. Your television was what got people to come. There's another factor at work here. I've tried to forget as much about working with the Poffos as I could.
I was going to say, even though you and Garvin and Orton kind of bought into the territory, you never really took care of that aspect of things in regards to the promotion side, like where you guys weren't out there trying to find the cities, the buildings, the venues or whatever. And obviously, like you said, Tony Peters was out there papering, flyering, if you will, whatever, putting up the posters in the windows and whatnot. We've talked a lot about the Poffos. But I can't see them investing trust in a lot of people to go out and promote for them for a town. So I can see where, that's why things were ran the way they were ran, unfortunately. But I get what you're saying. I try to forget as much as I can about that period, but it's still interesting. And I appreciate the question because I too, until, he wrote that and asked that question, I didn't really think about it, but you mentioned it in the past. They don't have a loop. They don't have specific cities that they constantly visited week after week. And so you're constantly driving around to random towns within a vicinity of states or cities or counties or what have you. And you're just going around asking, hey, well, can we run a show here? Sure. Yeah. And then the promotion starts. And how long do you have to promote? Right. To try. But in this instance, this listener states that the high school was packed. Now, how many people that is, I don't know. It's a high school gym. But at the same time, if you pack that many people in, now your logic is, well, okay, we could bring it back, but what if it's only half full next time? Because, we're one and done. We did it now. But at the same time, if I'm that successful in this city, why would I never try to go back at least once every few months? It just seems it's really odd logic. Right.
Well, I never had even an inkling of that kind of information about their plans because Angelo didn't trust anybody. We talked about trust. Angelo Papo didn't trust anybody because he was untrusty. You couldn't trust him. Well, you could trust him to screw you if he could, but you couldn't trust him to live up to his word, for example. You couldn't trust him to be fair. You couldn't trust him. And the reason why was because he wasn't trustworthy, because he would do anything for money, and that includes going back. His word meant nothing if money was involved. That's why it was impossible to trust a guy. And if you can't trust someone, why would you want to work with them? If they have a say so in your future, and you have no idea if they have your a lot of times if you're doing well, it's absolutely necessary for the promotion to do well, then you have some kind of a little insurance policy there that, that's obviously the promotion wants to get me over so they can make money, even though they're going to make 90 cents out of every dollar and I'm going to get the dime. They will do that just for their own self-interest. With Angelo, you could never count on that. So I didn't trust the guy as far as I could throw him. I wasn't going to get close enough to even want to throw him anywhere.
I get it.
But yeah, there's another factor, and I want this is kind of outside the box a little, but I'm sitting there reflecting on how I feel now. We're talking about stuff that, I could be an egomaniac with this. What I'm going to say is it sounds like egomaniacal, but I'm enjoying this a lot because, and here's why that has any importance at all, was because about the time that when I went to work for Bill Watts, I was seriously down on the business. I had tried twice to do opposition, and both times had been basically stymied by the other wrestlers, not only betraying me or us, but by the boys as a whole, as a group, shunning us and not being afraid to even talk to us. I had gotten such a downer attitude. I mean, just despair of like, oh my God, just how could this be? How could people not be willing even to work in their own self-interest to be willing to even take a chance? And I had lost a lot of respect, and I don't want to make the other boys out there think I feel like I'm looking down on them at all. And that's not the case at all. It was very difficult, and this is before contracts came along. It was very difficult to stand up to a promotion. The only thing you could do was quit, really. And I respected the guys that did that when they were upset about their pay and everything. They made a stand by saying, well, okay, I refuse to work if you're not going to pay me. I'll go somewhere else and see how they treat me. But so my attitude had gotten to the point where, and your attitude is very important because you're doing the same thing. You're going up and down the road, but are you optimistic? Are you satisfied? Are you fulfilled at all? Or are you upset? Are you discouraged? Are you feeling some despair? And I'd gotten to that negative part of it for the last part of my career. So by the time I ended up getting where I didn't work anymore, it didn't bother me because, it wasn't being a star, being on top and all that. It was all great on the surface, but behind the scenes, it was very unsatisfying. So I want to thank you, and not just you, Ray, as my partner here, but I want to thank everybody out there who's sharing this with us. I want to thank you because it's your involvement with our program that has got me given me the ability to do this and us to do this. And I thank Ray many times, and I'll continue to do it. But I have a completely different attitude about wrestling now. I'm looking back at the positive things, and my enjoyment for the business is back, and I'm really happy about that because I left I had been 40 years of kind of a bad taste in my mouth about my history, and now it's completely different. So I want to say thanks. I want to say thanks to you, Ray, and to everybody out there for that.
Yeah, no, it's been, well received. As far as I know, even the stories, we go back to the Southeastern stuff with Ron Fuller, and unless people are just talking behind our backs, I can't find anything really negative that's been said back after you stated your side, whether people still want to side with Ron Fuller, whether people want to believe who they want to believe in any of the stories. I think you coming out and basically addressing it, I think it's opened some new eyes, some new ears, and I think at the very least it gives food for thought for a lot of people that only heard one side. So I think it's done a lot of good to get out here and tell these stories about San Francisco, the misconception of how that all played out, and of course the Southeastern Territory and so on and so forth. We've got a ton of questions still for next week, guys. So it is going to be Ask Bob 3 as we continue on here in the new year. But don't worry, guys. We do have some other stories planned. Of course, we're going to talk about your entire run working for Ole and working in the ring there and Georgia Championship Wrestling. And of course, again, later on, Vince going to come in, take over TBS. We're going to get your thoughts about working for Ole after Vince taking over the cable spot, which was just insane at the time. And they called it Black Saturday. And of course, you booked in Florida, and we'll get to the global wrestling. I know there's some people out there specifically waiting with bated breath to get to global wrestling. But first, Ask Bob 3 coming right here next week on the Wrestling Stoop. Until then, guys, we're going to sign off. Bob, thank you again so much.
Well, thank you, Ray, and thanks again, folks, for joining us. We couldn't do it without you, so stay well. We'll be back at you soon.